It's the influence of television. Yeah, now, Marshall McLuhan deals with it in terms of it being a high intensity, you understand? A hot medium.
What I wouldn't give for a large sock with horse manure in it.
Which he uses essentially
What do you do when you get stuck on a movie line with a guy like this behind you?
Wait a minute, why can't I give my opinion? It's a free country.
He can give you. Do you have to give it so loud? I mean, aren't you ashamed to pontificate like that? And the funny part of it is, Marshall McLuhan, you don't know anything about Marshall McLuhan's work.
Really? I happen to teach a class at Columbia called TV, Media, and Culture. So I think that my insights into Mr. McLuhan, well, have a great deal of validity.
Oh, do you?
Yeah.
Well, that's funny because I happen to have Mr. McLuhan right here. So, yeah, just let me come over here a second.
Oh,
Tell him.
I heard what you were saying. You know nothing of my work. You mean my whole fallacy is wrong. How you ever got to teach a course in anything is totally amazing.
Boy, if life were only like this.
When you say the medium is the message, you're really saying that the ground is the message. It's not the content. The actual ground of services. It's not what you say in the telephone. It's the fact that the telephone service is environmental.
Cool in the slang form has come to mean involved, deeply participative, deeply engaged. Everything that we had formerly meant by heated argument is now called cool in slang. Cool, though the idea that cool it has reversed its meaning, I think has some bearing on the fact that our culture has shifted a good deal of its stress.
The age of electronic communications begins in the late 1840s with the first telegraph system, which was followed by the telephone in the 1880s, radio and motion pictures in the 1920s, television in the 1950s, and the computer internet or web in the 1990s. The one major theorist of how the new media have affected human behavior over that century and a half is Marshall McLuhan. The term mass media was already in use, and there was already great speculation about the mass media's grip on contemporary life. But once McLuhan lit up the sky in 1964 with his book Understanding Media, the term became his term, which was simply the media, and all discussion of the subject began with whether you agreed or disagreed with Marshall McLuhan. It's remained that way ever since. His ideas are as hotly debated today with the coming of the internet as they were in the 1960s when he became an academic star famous enough for a director like Woody Allen to want to put him into a movie. McLuhan's theory rests on a radical premise. He insists that nothing people can use electronic media for, no message that anyone, no matter how powerful or persuasive, can deliver, even begins to compare with what the new media have done to mankind neurologically and temperamentally. They have directly affected the human central nervous system and changed patterns of thought and behavior. In short, they have literally altered human nature. And there you have the basis of McLuhan's most widely quoted dictum, the medium is the message. The messages, the information transmitted via the new media were beside the point, compared to the way the electronic nature of the media has transformed human life. He believed that people raised after the advent of television have a different balance of the five senses from those raised during the preceding 4 centuries of a print-dominated world. They're more like primitive tribesmen, intimately involved with one another whether they like it or not, and captives of what they hear over the grapevine whether it's true or not. But this new electric tribe is worldwide and its grapevine is instantaneous, hence McLuhan's famous phrase to describe the late 20th century, the global village. Today, on the eve of the 21st century, with hot speculation about a coming digital civilization in which all humanity will be wired up and online so that geographic locations and national boundaries, or so it's predicted, will become irrelevant, McLuhan is very much in the center of the screen again, nearly 2 decades after his death, this time as the first seer of cyberspace. Marshall McLuhan, his full name was Herbert Marshall McLuhan, was born in Edmonton, Canada in 1911 and raised in a typical Scotch-Irish frame house with wooden obelisk half columns holding up the roof of the front porch. His father's forebears were Scotch-Irish farmers in Western Canada, and his father himself, Herbert McLuhan, was an insurance salesman. But his mother, Elsie Hall McLuhan, was another story. She was the cosmopolitan, a cultivated Easterner from the maritime provinces, English in background, well-educated, an elocutionist by training, a flamboyant figure in theater circles who toured Canada giving dramatic readings. Despite her many absences, it was she who ruled the family, and it was she who steered both Marshall and his younger brother Maurice toward intellectual careers. Maurice, known around the house as Red, eventually became a Presbyterian minister. The McLuhans lived modestly, but Elsie McLuhan would make sure in due course that her son Marshall, the academic star, was educated abroad. While he was still a boy, the family moved to Winnipeg, and he went to high school and college there, graduating from the University of Manitoba, which was about a mile from his house, with a bachelor's degree in 1932 and a master's degree in English literature in 1933. But his mother had grander credentials in mind. At her prodding, he applied for and won a scholarship to Cambridge University in England. At this point, McLuhan was very much the traditional young scholar, the literary man, a type he would later ridicule as smugly ignorant of the very nature of the medium he studied and labored in, namely print. As it turned out, in the 1930s, the literary life in Cambridge, at Oxford, and in London was anything but traditional. This was the trough of the Great Depression, and British intellectuals had begun to take an interest in the lower orders, in the masses, many as Marxists, but others as students of what would later be called popular culture. McLuhan was drawn to the work of Wyndham Lewis and the Cambridge scholar F.R. Levis, who were treating movies, radio, advertisements, and even comic strips as a new language. These were also the palmy days of Catholic writers such as Hilary Belloc and G.K. Chesterton, whose wit and sophistication had suddenly made Catholicism exciting, even smart, in literary circles. Two of the most brilliant and seemingly cynical of the London literati, W.H. Auden and Evelyn Waugh, converted to Catholicism at this period. And McLuhan also became a convert to Catholicism and to the study of popular culture. Although almost nothing in McLuhan's writing was to be overtly religious, these two passions eventually dovetail to create McLuhanism. After receiving a second bachelor's degree from Cambridge, he began his teaching career in 1936 in the United States at the University of Wisconsin. He returned to Cambridge in 1939 and over the next 3 years received a master's degree and a doctorate in English literature. After Wisconsin, he taught only in Catholic institutions, first the University of St. Louis, then at Assumption University in Windsor, Ontario, and finally at the Catholic College of the University of Toronto, St. Michael's, where he joined the faculty in 1946. By this time, Marshall McLuhan was 35 years old and the very embodiment of Elsie McLuhan's appetite for things intellectual and for the center of the stage. He was known both as a literary scholar, an expert in 16th and 17th century English literature and the work of James Joyce, and as a charismatic figure who captivated groups of students and faculty with his extracurricular Socratic gatherings devoted to the folklore of industrial man, as he called it, in which he would decode what he saw as the hidden language of advertisements, comic strips, and the press. For example, he'd show a slide of a Bayer aspirin ad, which featured a drum majorette wearing a military helmet and jack boots and carrying a baton about the size of a mace. The caption reads, "In 13.9 seconds, a drum majorette can twirl a baton 25 times, but in only 2 seconds, Bayer aspirin is ready to work." What's the true language of such an ad, he would ask. What does it really convey? Why, a goose-stepping combination of military mechanism and jack-booted eroticism, he would say, the wedding of sex and technology, a recurring advertising theme that he christened The Mechanical Bride. That was the title of his first book, published in 1951 when he was 40 years old. The Mechanical Bride had the conventional anti-business bias of the literary man, aimed as it was at liberating the public from the manipulations of the advertising industry. But it also led McLuhan into the orbit of his colleague at Toronto, the economic historian Harold Innis. As McLuhan himself was quick to point out, it was from 2 books published by Innis in 1950 and 1951, Empire and Communications and The Bias of Communication, that he drew the central concept of McLuhanism, namely that any great new medium of communication alters the entire outlook of the people who use it. Innis insisted that it was print, introduced in the 15th century by Johann Gutenberg, that had caused the spread of nationalism as opposed to tribalism over the next 400 years. McLuhan's first major theoretical work, The Gutenberg Galaxy, published in 1962, when he was 51 years old, was pretty much an elaboration of Innes's insight. His masterstroke came 2 years later when he brought the Innes approach forward into the 20th century and into the age of television with Understanding Media. He theorized that print had stepped up the visual sense of Western man at the expense of his other senses, which in turn led to many forms of specialization and fragmentation, from bureaucracy, the modern army and nationalistic wars, to schizophrenia, peptic ulcers, the cult of childhood, which he regarded as fragmentation by age, and pornography, the fragmentation of sex from love. In the second half of the 20th century, enter television. Television, said McLuhan, reverses the process and returns man's five senses to their pre-print, pre-literate tribal balance. The auditory and tactile senses come back into play, and man begins to use all of his senses again in a unified, seamless web of experience. Television, McLuhan maintained, is not a visual medium, but audio-tactile. This was the sort of contrary utterance he delighted in making, contradicting common sense without trying to explain or waiting to debate. In any case, the world was fast becoming a global village, that being the end result of television's seamless web spreading over the earth. The immediate effects of television on the central nervous system, said McLuhan, may be seen among today's young, the first television generation. The so-called generation gap, as he diagnosed it, was not ideological but neurological, the disparity between a print-bred generation and its audio-tactile, neo-tribal offspring. McLuhan, in fact, was observing the new generation up close. In the summer of 1939, he had been in California visiting his mother, who was teaching at the Pasadena Playhouse, when he met an American actress, Corinne Lewis, fell in love with her, proposed to her, and then, right then and there, he married her on the spot, and he took her off to Cambridge, all in such short order that she had to wire her parents to let them know she was now Mrs. McLuhan. Marshall and Corinne McLuhan had 6 children, 4 daughters and 2 sons. Personally, McLuhan had little patience with television or any other electronic medium. But he looked on with awe as his children seemed to study for school, watch television, talk on the telephone, listen to the radio, and play phonograph records all at the same time. The new generation, he was convinced, was bound to sit baffled and bored in classrooms run by print-bound teachers. This meant that the educational system must be totally changed. But then the new sensory balance was going to bring about total change, and he used a capital T and a capital C in any event. Just as the wheel was an extension of the human foot, and the axe was an extension of the arm, the electric media were extensions of the human central nervous system, and these nervous systems would be brought together in an irresistible way. Human nature would now be different. Nationalism, the product of print, would become impossible. Instead, there would be the global village. It would no longer be possible to insulate racial groups from one another. Instead, all would be irrevocably involved and responsible for one another. McLuhan warned that the global village was not a prescription for utopia. In fact, it might just as easily turn out to be a bloodbath. After all, where do we find the most accomplished butchers, he asked at one point? In villages. The global village could bring all humanity together for slaughter as easily as anything else. Yet he also believed that the New Age offered the possibility of something far more sublime than utopia, which is, after all, a secular concept. The Christian concept of the mystical body, McLuhan wrote in one of the few explicit references he makes to this dream of his, of all men as members of the body of Christ, this becomes technologically a fact under electronic conditions. And here we see the shadow of an intriguing figure who influenced McLuhan every bit as much as Harold Innis, but to whom he never referred, Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. Teilhard de Chardin was a French geologist and paleontologist who had first made a name for himself through fossil hunting expeditions in China and Central Asia. At the age of 30 in 1911, the year it so happens McLuhan was born, he became a Jesuit priest and taught geology at the Catholic Institute in Paris. His mission in life, however, became to take Darwin's theory of biological evolution, which had so severely shaken Christian belief, and show that biological evolution was merely the first step in God's grander design for the evolution of man. God was directing in this very moment, the 20th century, the evolution of man into a noosphere. That was Teilhard de Chardin's coinage, a noosphere, a unification of all human nervous systems, all human souls through technology. He mentions radio, television, and computers specifically and in considerable detail, and talks about cybernetics. His powers of prediction were astonishing. He died in 1955 when television had only recently come into widespread use and the microchip had not even been invented. Computers were huge machines that were not yet in assembly line production. But he was already writing about the extraordinary network of radio and television communication which already links us all in a sort of etherized human consciousness, and of those astonishing electronic computers which enhance the speed of thought and pave the way for a revolution in the sphere of research. This technology was creating a nervous system for humanity, he wrote, a single, organized, unbroken membrane over the earth, a stupendous thinking machine. The age of civilizations has ended, and that of one civilization, and he underlined one civilization, is beginning. That unbroken membrane, that noosphere, was of course McLuhan's seamless web of experience, and that one civilization was McLuhan's global village. We may think, wrote Teilhard, that these technologies are artificial and completely external to our bodies, but in fact they are part of the natural and profound evolution of our nervous systems. We may think that we are only amusing ourselves by using them, or only developing our commerce, or only spreading ideas. In reality, we are quite simply continuing on a higher plane, by other means, the uninterrupted work of biological evolution. Or to put it another way, the medium is the message. Now, privately, McLuhan acknowledged his tremendous debt to Teilhard de Chardin. Publicly, he never did. And why? For fear it would undercut his own reputation for originality? That would have been very much out of character. After all, he not only acknowledged his debt to Harold Innis, but even went so far as to call his first book, The Gutenberg Galaxy, quote, a footnote of explanation to his work. The more likely reason is that within Catholic intellectual circles, and we have to remember that McLuhan was on the faculty of the University of Toronto's Catholic College, St. Michael's, Teilhard Chardin was under a cloud of heterodoxy. Decades earlier, the Church had forbade him from teaching or publishing his theory of evolution, since he accepted most of Darwinism as truth. None of his 6 books on the subject was published in his lifetime. But among intellectuals at St. Mike's, as they called St. Michael's College, there was a lively underground, a kind of Jesuit samizdat in Teilhard de Chardin manuscripts, especially after he moved to the United States in 1951. McLuhan was fascinated by Teilhard, but Teilhard presented a problem. Even in death, he remained out of the bounds of Catholic theology, and McLuhan took his faith very seriously, all the more so because he was a convert from Protestantism teaching in a major Catholic institution. But Teilhard presented a secular problem as well. McLuhan was living in an age in which academic work with even a tinge of religion was not going to be taken seriously. Inside the Church, Teilhard may have been considered too much of a Darwinian scientist, but outside the Church, he was considered too much of a Catholic mystic. When Understanding Media was published in 1964, it was loaded with Teilhard de Chardin, but it would have taken another Teilhard enthusiast to detect it, and a rather subtle one at that. Not a single theological note was struck. Indeed, Understanding Media exploded upon the intellectual world in the mid-1960s with a distinctly earthly brilliance, and immediately caught the attention of many of the most devoutly materialistic and practical minds in commerce and industry. In part, it was the deceptively simple title, Understanding Media, which came across as a challenge. You people who use the media, who own the media, who invest millions in the media and depend on the media, you don't begin to understand the media. By late 1964, corporations such as General Electric and IBM were inviting McLuhan to the United States to talk to their executives. Their attitude was not so much he's right, as what if he is right? We'd better find out. McLuhan informed General Electric that they might think they were in the business of making light bulbs, but in fact they were in the business of moving information, every bit as much as AT&T. Electric light was pure information, a medium without a message. IBM he somewhat condescendingly praised for having finally realized that they were not in the business of manufacturing equipment, but of processing information. He excelled at telling powerful and supposedly knowledgeable people they didn't have the foggiest comprehension of their own enterprises. He never adopted a tone of intentional shock, however. He was always the scholar, speaking with utter seriousness. He had a way of pulling his chin down into his neck and looking up out of his long Scottish lordly face before he delivered his most Delphic pronouncements. He seemed to exist out and beyond all of them, surveying them from a Sears cosmic plane. But what turned Marshall McLuhan from a University of Toronto English professor with an interesting theory into McLuhan, a name known worldwide, was the curious intervention of a San Francisco advertising man named Howard Gossage. Fascinated by understanding media, Gossage took it upon himself, at his own expense, to become McLuhan's herald, bringing him to the United States in 1965 and introducing him to the press and the advertising industry on the West Coast and in New York. It proved to be a brilliant campaign. Magazine articles, newspaper stories, television appearances were generated at an astonishing rate. Late in 1965, both Harper's Magazine and New York Magazine published major pieces about McLuhan. In the single year 1966, the number grew to more than 120 in just about every important publication in the United States, Canada, and Great Britain. The excitement was over the possibility that here might be a man with an insight of Darwinian or Freudian proportions. As his fame grew, so did the ranks of his detractors, particularly among literary people, whom he regularly wrote off as hidebound, reactionary, and oblivious of how even their own medium, print, actually worked. Scientists, meantime, didn't know what to make of McLuhan one way or the other. The heart of his theory, the concept of the human sensory balance, falls within the field of cognitive psychology, or more broadly, neuroscience. Today, neuroscience is the hottest subject in the academic world. But even now, there is no way of determining whether or not any such balance exists, or whether or not a medium such as television can alter one individual's nervous system, let alone an entire society and the course of history. McLuhan treated any and all critics with a rather maddening aloofness. He was not trying to create a self-contained body of theory, he insisted, although in fact he probably was. He was a pioneer, heading out into a vast terra incognita. So little was known, and there was so little time. His mission was to explore, to make the probes, to use one of his favorite words, to open up the territory. Others, those who came after, could conduct the systematic investigations, run the clinical experiments, organize the data, and settle the disputes. He managed to make all opposition sound like what Freud called resistance, a reluctance to let go of the comfortable notions of the past in the face of brilliant new revelations about the nature of the human animal. McLuhan died in 1980 at the age of 69 after a series of strokes which had left him unable to speak, read, or write. He never lived to see the evolution of the computer into a communications medium in the form of the internet or web. Yet he had made reference to the computer, likening it to television as one of the neo-tribal media that demanded pattern recognition rather than the linear and compartmentalized approach of print. No doubt the internet would have delighted him. He would have seen it as a fulfillment of prophecies he had made 30 years before it was born, as a more direct and intimately tribal form of the global village than television, and as an even more likely instrument for the realization of his dream of the mystical unity of all mankind. Here, in a specific, physical, electronic form, was the seamless web of which he had so often spoken. Today, thousands of young internet apostles are familiar with Marshall McLuhan and are convinced that his light shines round about them. From the editors of Wired magazine to the most miserable .com lizards of the chat rooms, they have made him their patron saint. The medium is the message. In what follows, we will see and hear the man himself, Marshall McLuhan, as he attempts to spread his message via the medium that intrigued him most, television. McLuhan was an extraordinarily prolific writer of scholarly articles, and by 1958, a full 6 years before the publication of Understanding Media, his views on the electric media were already so well known in academic circles. He was the central figure in a television panel discussion at Ohio State University, moderated by the leading American cultural critic of the day, Gilbert Seldes. Here we will see him enunciate what would become one of his most famous theorems a decade later, namely that television is a cool medium that won't tolerate hot characters.
On one side, we're all trying to find out what is the nature of the new communications? What is the special nature of each one of the media, such as, say, the moving picture or broadcasting? What is the nature of all of them, all of the mass media, as we call them, put together? And I think that from that, almost everybody in the field certainly isn't satisfied with stopping, deciding what is the essence. We're not Platonists. I think we all then want to say, what do all these media do to us? And then I'll put my own specialty in. What do we do about that? Now, I don't think I differ too much from you, Mr. McLuhan.
No, I've learned a great deal from your own work, Mr. Seldes, and you were in this field before any of us. And we've toiled along in your footsteps, as it were.
You and I share, however, I'm pretty sure share an enthusiasm for someone else, which is Harold Innes, the Canadian economist.
Yes,
Don't you think that he phrased the essence, really, of the revolution in, you probably know the actual words that he used, of the connection between an enormous change in the means of communication and a change following in society?
His notion that any change in handling information, communication, is bound to cause a great readjustment of all the social patterns, the educational patterns, the sources and conditions of political power, public opinion patterns will change. But he got onto that track rather interestingly. You see, as an economic historian, he had been studying railways and the cod fisheries, the fur trade, and the pulp and paper, and he moved then from staples as forms of shaping economic life to media as staples. And he began to study the new media as really basic economic resources. And much as, for example, cotton in the South has shaped a whole culture, now radio is shaping a global culture. It's global in the extent of its resource availability. So that what would appear to be in the offing is a global culture conformable to a staple like radio, as the Southern culture was conformable to cotton.
But then he went on. The simple example that after print came in, the whole feudal system broke.
Yes.
Now, what I'm worried about, and he didn't live long enough to predict it even, is what is going to break? Where is the shift in power going to be at the present time?
The tremendous developments that we made in individual, private habits of study, isolated effort, inner direction, and so on, these are likely to take the rap from media that are so inclusive of the whole of society and at all levels. Think of the tremendous shift in political power that is going on at this moment through the use of television in politics. And McCarthy folded in a week after he went on television. If Huey Long had gone on the TV, he would have been a flop at once. TV will not take a sharp character, a hot character. It's a cool medium. And our politics are being cooled off to the point of rigor mortis, according to many people.
I want to do it. Why not?
The nature of this medium, which calls for so much participation, does not give you a completed package, a completed image. You have to make your image as you go. Therefore, if the person who comes in front of the TV camera is already a very complete and classifiable type of person, a politician, a highly obvious doctor type, lawyer type, the medium rejects him because there's nothing left for the audience to view or to complete. And they say, this guy's a phony. There's something wrong with this guy.
I'd like to have you react to this notion that since the founding of our country, we've had the balance of power progressively go from a very small group that were voting, and had property rights and so on, gradually spread to a larger and larger group. Now, how does television fit into this? We have practically universal television as far as it being in the homes of concerned. Does this mean that the power more and more is flowing really to the popular group?
Yes, literally the participation of the whole population in the political process becomes very deep. And where it's no longer a question of assessing arguments, platforms, regional clashes, and so on, everybody is with it. All age groups. Yes, the issues are no longer given to you on single planes and single patterns. They're total.
But this is a very good point about being deep. Is this actually a kind of a pseudo-event? I mean, you think you are with reality, but really, you are having prepared for you on television those aspects they want you to see, which gives you a feeling of participation you may not really have.
The audience is making a new form of association among its own members. They are making a new reality,
in other words,
new art form.
You don't think we're learning more things superficially?
No.
You don't?
No, this is an age in which in the new criticism or psychology or anything else, the word used in all these forms is depth. It's
I know.
Reading in depth, psychology in depth, everything now
is in depth. These are the relatively few experts and outsiders.
No.
Your implication now is, it seems to be the opposite of what you were saying a few minutes ago. And I'm not trying to trap you, Marshall. I'm trying to find out. but at one point, is my understanding that the thing we need to be troubled about by these mass media is their creation of the non-individualistic person, the man who is with it, so he's with what everyone is doing, to use what is now the hackneyed word, the conforming person. On the other side, you are saying that, however, television can be used to convey information in depth, and the implication is it can actually be used to make people think.
The forms of entertainment that work best on television, whether it's Padishevsky or even the Power Show, are ones which admit of a great deal of casualness, in which people can be introduced and dialogued with in the presence of the camera at all sorts of levels of their lives. You capture them at all sorts of strange and offbeat moments of their existence. And this kind of probing and peeling off the superficial aspects of people and so on is normal to this medium. It is a depth medium. The movie medium is, by comparison, very much a photographic slick package medium, which gives you a very highly defined and a very slick, complete package.
You know, McLuhan, you might do what I've known you to do, which is to characterize the former period as the print period and the present period as the electronic period, and kind of point out what sharp distinctions you think are involved.
I think people who are subjected to the arrangement of language visually in lines, highly sequential and precise, rigid, develop habits of arranging their lives, arranging their whole social existence, which are very closely geared to these forms. They're not specially aware of this. Lineality, though, is not characteristic of radio or television or movies. And so we have been subjected to tremendous new forces, new influences, which have broken up the older habits acquired from the print world. This is a good time, I think, to bring up a point that when any new form comes into the foreground of things, we naturally look at it through the old stereos.
Yes,
we can't help that. This is normal, and we're still trying to see how will our previous political and educational patterns persist under television. We're just trying to fit the old things into the new form, instead of asking, what is the new form going to do to all the assumptions we had before?
After the publication of Understanding Media in 1964, McLuhan became the subject of a two-part program of the British Broadcasting Company with the literary critic Frank Kermode as the interviewer. McLuhan was fond of talking about environments humans inhabited without being aware of them. Today, decades later, we can't help but notice the clouds of cigarette smoke in which these two learned men dwelt obliviously on this talk show.
In a sense, you've been a historian as you've gone about your work. And let's talk first a little, if we may, about your book, The Gutenberg Galaxy, where you argue that for a long time, without actually understanding it, we've been living in a culture in which our whole way of looking at the world has been determined by typography, by the successiveness of print and so on. Would you like to enlarge on that a bit?
Well, I remember I decided to write that book when I came across a piece by J.C. Carruthers, a psychiatrist, on the African mind in health and disease, describing the effects of the printed word on the African populations. It startled me and decided me to plunge in. But we have a better opportunity in seeing our old technologies when they confront other populations elsewhere in the world. The effects they have on those people are so startling and so sudden that we have an opportunity to see what happened to us over many centuries.
Yes, which we couldn't see because we're inside the system.
Yeah.
Don't you say that what happened was that we got used to having our information processed as it is in print. That is to say, it's set out successively, whereas at the root of your thoughts, perhaps, there's the view that we can see the world as an image instantaneously, but that we've chosen, under the pressure of a technology, to set it out successively like a block of print.
Well, every technology has its own ground rules, as it were. It decides all sorts of arrangements in other spheres. The fact of script and the ability to make inventories and collect data and store data changed many social habits and processes back as early as 3000 BC. However, that's about as early as scripts began. The effects of rearranging one's experience, organizing one's experience by these new extensions of our powers, are quite unexpected. Perhaps one way of putting it is to say that writing represents a high degree of specializing of our powers.
Yes.
Compared to pre-literate societies, there is a considerable concentration on one faculty when you develop a skill like scripting.
And this is the visual, what you call the visual.
Yes,
faculty.
this is a highly specialized stress compared to anything in ordinary oral societies. There have been many studies made of this in various ways. But in our own Western world, the rise of the phonetic alphabet seems to have had much to do with Platonic culture and the ordering of experience in the terms of ideas, classifying of data and experience by ideas.
You mean that that sight has become the preeminent sense, as it was for Plato, and it went on being so in so-called civilized as opposed to primitive societies?
Increasingly so.
Till it reached the climax with the invention of printing.
Printing stepped it up to a considerable pitch, yes.
Now, how would you describe the impact of the invention of the printing press? Give us some instances of what happened as a consequence of this.
It created almost overnight. It created what we call nationalism. What in effect was a public. The old manuscript forms were not sufficiently powerful instruments of technology to create publics in the sense that print was able to do. Unified, homogeneous reading publics. Everything that we prize in our Western world in matters of individualism and separatism and of unique point of view, private judgment, all those factors are highly favored by the printed word and not really favored by other forms of culture like radio or earlier even by manuscript. But this stepping up of the fragmented, the private, the individual, the private judgment, the point of view, in fact, our whole vocabularies underwent huge change with the arrival of such technology.
Yeah. Could I ask you now about the technology which, on your view, is superseding it and which is having its own effect on our lives, comparable with, but of course entirely different in kind to the Gutenberg technology.
The Gutenberg technology was mechanical to an extreme degree. In fact, it originated a good deal of the later mechanical revolution, assembly line style, and the fragmentation of operations and functions as the very rationale of industrialization.
Yes.
This fragmentation had begun much earlier with after the hunter and the food gatherers with Neolithic man. I suppose in an extreme way one might say that Gutenberg was the last phase of the Neolithic revolution. Gutenberg plus the industrial revolution that followed was a pushing of specialism that came in with the Neolithic man, the agrarian revolution, a pushing of specialism all the way, and then suddenly we encounter the electric or electromagnetism, which seems to have a totally different principle, for some people feel, an extension of our nervous system, not an extension of merely of our bodies. If the wheel is an extension of feet and tools of hands, back, arms, the electromagnetism seems to be in its technological manifestations an extension of our nerves and becomes mainly an information system. It is above all a feedback or looped system. The peculiarity, you see, after the age of the wheel, you suddenly encounter the age of the circuit. The wheel pushed to an extreme suddenly acquires opposite characteristics. This seems to happen with a good many technologies, that if they get pushed to a very distant point, they reverse their characteristics.
What difference is the electric technology making to our interest in content, in what the medium actually says?
A very complex business, I'm sure, but one of the effects of switching over to circuitry from mechanical moving parts and wheels is an enormous increase in the amount of information that is moving.
Yes.
You cannot cope with vast amounts of information in the old fragmentary classified patterns. You tend to go looking for mythic and structural forms in order to manage such complex data and moving at very high speed. So the electric engineers often speak of pattern recognition as a normal need of people processing data electrically and by computers and so on. Need for pattern recognition. It's a need which the poets foresaw a century ago in their drive back to mythic forms of organizing experience.
Well, here we are, a couple of archaic literate men, Gutenberg men, talking on the television. What is the audience getting from this? Is it listening to what we're saying, or is it feeling the impact of a new electric medium?
There is a book called "Is Anybody Listening?" It's what worries the advertising man a great deal. The idea of feedback, of being involved in one's participating in one's own audience participation, is a natural product of this circuitry.
Yeah.
Everything under electric conditions is looped. You become folded over into yourself, into your image of yourself changes completely.
In the second part of this BBC program with Frank Kermode, McLuhan gets into the aspects of his theory of television that most completely confounded ordinary common sense. Why television, which seems so highly visual, is actually a tactile medium, why television, which seems so shallow, is actually a depth medium, and why television, which seems so ploddingly literal-minded, is actually a mythic medium.
In your other book, the more recent one, where you, Understanding Media, where you go into all this, you use as a kind of slogan, I think, the expression, the medium is the message. Would you like to illuminate that?
I think it is more satisfactory to say that any medium, be it radio or be it wheel, tends to create a completely new human environment.
Yeah.
The human environment is, as such, tends to have a kind of invisible character about it. The unawareness of the environmental is compensated for by some attention to the content of the environment. The environment as merely a set of ground rules and as a kind of overall enveloping force gets very little recognition as a form, except from the artist. I think our arts, if you look at them in this connection, do throw quite a lot of light on environments. The artist is usually engaged in somewhat excitedly explaining to people the character of new environments and new strategies of culture necessary to cope with them. Blake is an extreme case of a man who was absolutely panicked by the kind of new environment that he saw forming around him under the auspices of Newton and Locke and industrialism. He thought it was going to smash the unity of the imaginative and sensory life all to bits. But the artist, what he was insisting upon in his own lifetime became quite a popular and widespread movement later on.
Yeah, can I return to television? Because here we are, where whoever's listening to us is also undergoing the impact of television at the moment. On your view, they're all deceiving themselves insofar as they're paying attention to what we're saying, because what's going on is a medium which is in itself the image that they ought to be concerning themselves with.
The medium of television has many characteristics which have been unheeded. Mostly it is seen under the aspect of movie form. The TV camera does not have a shutter, does not take pictures. It handles, it picks up, as radio picks up, the TV camera picks up its environment, handles it, scans it, and the effect of the TV image is iconic in the sense that it shapes things by contours rather than by little snapshots.
Now, this is one of the words that you use a good deal, iconic. I think we'd better be clear what you mean by it.
I think of it, again, to tie in with Blake, his whole insistence upon the engraved, the highly patterned and highly sculptured forms and images. The iconic in that sense is very low in visual quality, very high in tactual quality. Active touch, not cutaneous, but active touch, as the psychologists insist.
You call television a tactile medium,
iconic medium.
Okay.
Having much in common with the cartoon for which it is ideally suited. much more well suited than for pictures.
If you feel that we are going to have to come to terms, or we are coming to terms, much more than typographical man with this kind of instantaneous image, and I'd like now just to ask you about the distinction that you draw between different kinds of media within the electric technology. You call some, such as television, cool, and some, such as radio, hot. Now, what does this mean?
It has to do with the slang phrase, the hot and the cool, which puzzles many people. The way it's used in slang reverses the meaning of cool. Cool in the slang form has come to mean involved, deeply participative, deeply engaged. Everything that we had formerly meant by heated argument is now called cool in slang. Cool, though the idea that cool, it has reversed its meaning, I think has some bearing on the fact that our culture has shifted a good deal of its stress into a demand that we be more committed, more involved in the situations in which we ordinarily work and experience.
A cool medium is one in which the definition is low and the audience has to work and supply the gaps.
Well, like a cartoon, you see,
like
you were mentioning before. This is real cool.
Yes.
Whereas jazz, as compared with classical music, has many of these aspects of discontinuity and very much room for fill-in.
Yes.
But where the information or data level is low, the fill-in or participation is high. If you fill the situation with complex data, the opportunity for completion fill-in is less and participation is less.
Now, this reminds me to ask you what I think is pretty important about your work, that if you've got phases like this, which are determined technologically, one can not only speak about the kind of the state of affairs we now have, one can also to some degree do some prediction. Now, I think in understanding media you sometimes write as if we'd we'd pushed on deeper into electric technology than we actually have. But you do venture some predictions about the kind of life, the kind of quality of feeling that we're going to have with the new alteration in our senses. Could you say something about that?
Well, I remember when I was here 2 years ago, after a long absence, I was quite startled at the upsurge of regional dialects in England as compared with 20 years earlier. And the relative decline of standard and homogeneous English, and the quite proud display of dialects that I had hardly heard before when I lived here. This drive in depth toward a regional depth of culture is a normal feature of electronic forms because of this circuitry that involves us deeper and deeper in ourselves. The French separatists, for example, at the present time in Quebec, are very much related to this new image they have of themselves in television, a depth image.
The vision of the future that your book could leave one with is one in a big brother image, in a sense. You speak of for example, programming cultures. For instance, you say that if the South African scene looks like getting too hot because of an overdose of radio, we program a lot of television, cool them off. This kind of interference with what the typographical literate man calls human rights.
We have never stopped interfering drastically with ourselves by every technology we could latch onto. We have absolutely disrupted
and you think this might
our lives over and over again.
Lead us into a kind of electric totalitarianism?
No, I think the logic, if unimpeded, the logic of this sort of electric world is stasis.
Yes. And out of this, forgive me for interrupting again.
Yes.
I was going to ask you, where do you see, is there a terminus, or should we always go from the thesis of typography to the...
I think if there is a logic, and a hopeful one, that appears in this, it is the dispelling of all unconscious aspects of our lives altogether, that we, in order to live with ourselves in such depth, in such instant feedback situations. We have to understand everything so that our easygoing lolling about in the lap of the unconscious cannot endure. That we will have to take over the total human environment as an artifact. But it seems to be forced upon us. The need to become completely autonomous and aware of all the consequences of everything we're doing before the consequences occur is where we're heading.
McLuhan had a distinctive and surprisingly effective television style. Well, that should have surprised him in any case, since he was that very same sharp or hot character he said television would reject. He was the complete monomaniac on television. The theorist who had a theory he was going to get across and who would not be deflected. He never pandered to television as an entertainment medium. He never paused to be ingratiating or charming. He couldn't abide talk show small talk. He spoke not only in complete sentences, but complete paragraphs. If he didn't care for a question, he simply waited for the interviewer's lips to stop moving and took the last few words he uttered and turned them into a transition to a new paragraph of his own. By the late 1960s, he had quite successfully made the world aware that television was a medium that held modern man in its thrall in profound ways that didn't meet the eye. This he did in the most old-fashioned way possible, by saying so to as many people as he could in no uncertain terms and in however many paragraphs it took.
The great power of the phonetic alphabet, as discovered in antiquity, consisted in creating a means of translating all languages and all human activities into a common set of symbols, which were quite neutral and non-involving. Literate culture, as discovered by the Greeks and practiced by the Romans, created civilization in the sense that it created a high order of civilized culture from which people could detach themselves. That is, literate culture is visual and detached. It creates the civilized man, the detribalized man, the man who is not involved. And the effect of the electric revolution is to create once more an involvement that is total. Privacy was almost unknown, even in Shakespeare's day. It came in after that period in the 17th, 18th centuries, and it was dependent upon an architecture that sealed off spaces. People didn't live in private spaces in earlier periods, and it was with the coming of the book and the need for areas and private areas in which to read and study and so on that privacy gradually caught on as a value. I don't think privacy has quite the same meaning in our time that it used to have. The electronic world is simultaneous, instantaneous, spherical, and third world, intuitive and right hemisphere. The right hemisphere seems to be the normal and naturally dominant hemisphere of non-literate man. Only temporarily was it phased out by the rise of the alphabet technology. Many of the things I talk about I find very irritating. That's what leads me to investigate them. You know, you look around for a hair of the dog that bit you. I look into many of the new forms simply because I find them very exasperating and irritating and troublesome to peace of mind and so on. And on the other hand, I've discovered, to my amazement, that if you take some violent and irritating process, say like radio or TV, and start looking at how it works, what it's doing to you, and why it's doing it to you, you can get very enthralled, very excited.
McLuhan was past 50 when he published the book that made him famous, Understanding Media, in 1964. And yet in the broad sweep of 20th century history, his timing couldn't have been better. The 1960s were one of those recurring periods in the West when people of all sorts, including some very bright people, become susceptible to visions of an entire world made new. Was McLuhan alone in believing that the new generation, the youth of the 1960s, were fundamentally different from the generations that had gone before? Not at all. The otherwise skeptical and highly rational French philosopher Jean-Francois Revel toured American college campuses in the late 1960s and returned to France and wrote a book called Neither Marx Nor Jesus, in which he said there had arisen in the United States a homo novus, a new man. He was talking mainly about student activists and hippies, groups that had gone to great lengths through dress and speech to indicate that they were profoundly removed from the mindsets of their parents. Charles Reich wrote a highly acclaimed book called The Greening of America, in which he said this young homo novus had cast off the narrowness of untold, benighted centuries and opened up his eyes, his mind, and his heart to the full range of human sensibilities. Exactly what this meant, no one could ever explain. It didn't require getting a job in any case. One merely had to be, and to be young. So the young, naturally enough, were willing to take such philosophers at their word. There ensued 2 decades of subsidized loafing, paid for by willing parents as well as governments, in which school performance in the United States, especially among the brightest 10% of the students, sank to its lowest point in the 20th century. But that's another story. In any event, everyone from scholars to journalists to the young themselves were primed to listen to McLuhan's theory that the homo novus might be the product of the new electric media. As we are about to be informed, the hippies thought McLuhan was wonderful, but they seemed to be listening to only half of what he was saying. This electric age is the dawn of the greatest of all human ages, we will hear McLuhan declare. But then he quickly adds that the word greatest merely means biggest, not best. As we are about to see in an interview with the Canadian Broadcasting Company's Bob Fulford in 1966, McLuhan had the novel notion that the homo novus, the teenager of the mid-60s, was a far more realistic, serious, and meditative creature than the teenagers of the generations before, all thanks to television and its involving quality. He also accurately predicts the sort of interactive communication that has become possible over the past few years via the internet. At the very outset of the interview, we'll see a classic example of how McLuhan handled questions he didn't care for. Listen closely as he utters a transitional sentence that seems to pertain to the question, then heads straight off onto the subject he wanted to talk about in the first place.
You've been writing about the mass media for a good many years, and now you're an object of the mass media. How has this changed your view of it, if at all?
Let me instead explain why this has happened. Because, you see, suddenly, if you've noticed, the mood of North America has changed very drastically. Things like the safety car couldn't have happened 10 years ago.
Why is that?
Now, it's because people have suddenly become obsessed with consequences of things. They used to be obsessed with mere products and packages and launching these things out into markets and into the public. Now they've suddenly become concerned about what happens when these things go out on the highway. What happens when this kind of program gets on the air? What happens? They want safety air, safety cigarettes, safety cars, and safety programming. This need for safety is a sudden awareness that things have effects. Now, my writing has for years been concerned with the effects of things, not their impact, but their consequences after impact. TV, unlike the fantasy world, the escape world of the movies, TV creates enormously serious and realistic-minded sort of person, well, almost oriental in his inward meditativeness. I think
this is the teenager of today.
Yes, he's becoming almost oriental in his inwardness.
He's so thoughtful and serious.
Yeah, grim. Whereas the movie generations of the 20s and 30s were a coon-coated bunch of superficial types, had a good time, and went to college, but not for knowledge and that sort of thing. All has changed.
And changed because of television, because
very much. Television gave the old electric circuitry that is already here, gave it a huge extra push in this direction of involvement and inwardness. You see, the circuit doesn't just simply push things out for inspection. It pushes you in to the circuit. It involves you. When you put a new medium into a play in a given population, all their sensory life shifts a bit, sometimes shifts a lot. This changes their outlook, their attitudes, changes their feelings about studies, about school, about politics. Since TV, both Canadian and British and American politics have cooled off almost to the point of rigor mortis. Our politics require much more hotting up than the TV medium will give them. TV is ideal. You see, when you've got two experts like ourselves discussing TV, this is good TV because there's a process going on of mutual challenge, discovery, and processing. Now, TV is good for that, and same with ads. if the audience can become involved in the actual process of making the ad, then it's happy. It's like the old quiz shows. They were great TV because it gave the audience a role, something to do. They were horrified when they discovered they'd really been left out all the time because the shows are rigged. Now, this is a horrible misunderstanding of TV on the part of the programmers. But in the same way, most advertisers do not understand TV media. Do you know that most people read ads about things they already own? They don't read things to buy them, but to feel reassured that they have already bought the right thing. In other words, they get huge information satisfaction from ads, far more than they do from the product itself. Where advertising is heading is quite simply into a world where the ad will become a substitute for the product, and all the satisfactions will be derived informationally from the ad, and the product will be merely a number in some file somewhere. Instead of going out and buying a package book, of which there have been 5,000 copies printed, you will go to the telephone, describe your interests, your needs, your problems, and say, I'm working now on the history of Egyptian arithmetic, I know a bit of Sanskrit, I'm qualified in German, and I am a good mathematician. They said, it'll be right over. And they at once Xerox, with the help of computers from the libraries of the world, all the latest material just for you personally, not as something to be put out on the bookshelf. They send you the package as a direct personal service. This is where we're heading under electronic information conditions. Products increasingly are becoming services.
What kind of a world would you rather live in? Is there a period in the past or a possible period in the future you'd rather be in?
I'd rather be in any period at all, as long as people are going to leave it alone for a while. Just let go, just leave it now.
But they're not going to, are they?
No. So the only alternative is to understand everything that's going on and then neutralize it as much as possible, turn off as many buttons as you can, and frustrate them as much as you can. I am resolutely opposed to all innovation, all change, but I am determined to understand what's happening, because I don't choose just to sit and let the juggernaut roll over me. Now, many people seem to think that if you talk about something recent, you're in favor of it. The exact opposite is true in my case. Anything I talk about is almost certainly to be something I'm resolutely against. And it seems to me the best way of opposing it is to understand it, and then you know where to turn off the button.
As Norman Mailer interviews McLuhan for the Canadian Broadcasting Company in 1967, we will notice that McLuhan is careful to stop short of calling the new age good or bad. He merely calls it new.
One of the reasons I'm absolutely fascinated with Marshall McLuhan's work is that it's the only time I've ever encountered a system of ideas which are fascinating, just about totally comprehensive, brilliant, charged with metaphor, extraordinarily stimulating, and yet finally there's not a single place in which I find a real, if you will, existential common ground. Where McLuhan and I start off being a tiny hair apart and getting further and further apart at a great rate is precisely on the nature of the artist, because Marshall speaks of him as a man who essentially records, who is the man who delineates the new features of each particular period. And I would say that the artist does that, and he does one step more, he goes one step further, and he then decides whether this is good or bad. And it doesn't matter whether the artist finally is right or wrong and whether it's good or bad. What he does do is he gives the people who come into contact with his art a subtler sense of good and bad, and therefore they have a better ability to determine for themselves whether something is good or bad. Now, the reason I keep hitting this notion of good or bad is that in all of McLuhan land, you'd never find the words good or bad. You find many jokes about the sort of Victorian, Edwardian, and gay 20s indignations about
Norman,
his
do you
lack
remember
of
a phrase of Edmund Burke's? I do not know how to draw up an indictment against a whole people. Now, I wouldn't know how to value the Western world, which we're demolishing by our new technology, or the Oriental world, which we are westernizing. We're demolishing the Oriental world and
at a great rate, yes,
and demolishing the Western world. I don't know whether that's good or bad, because I wouldn't know how to make a value judgment on such a scale.
Both Mailer and Malcolm Muggeridge appeared on the CBC with McLuhan in 1968, along with the CBC's Bob Fulford. Muggeridge obviously doesn't buy McLuhan's theory and goes so far as to suggest that McLuhan might be trapped in a mental environment he himself is unaware of, a naive American as opposed to a skeptical European way of looking at things.
Well, for heaven's sake, this present time we're moving into, this electric age, is the dawn of much the greatest of all human ages. There's nothing to even remotely resemble the scope of human awareness and human greatness.
There we are, a value judgment.
Yeah, I'm talking. No, this is quantity. Marshall, most people make their judgments in terms of quantity. No, I'm merely saying quantitatively, this is by far the greatest human age. What further valuations would you wish to have brought to bear?
Well, I thought when you said greatest, you meant finest. That is, it would be more admirable than Renaissance, Florence, or something.
Do you mean biggest? Yes, we're 1,000 times greater than the Victorian age.
In size?
In size.
But not in quality?
I don't know.
You don't know?
We may not, there might be some way. I mean, let's say if there's a good Lord, it's possible he might measure these epics by how a handful of air appeals to him. In other words, he might take a handful of air out of one epic and say, marvelous air.
Yeah.
He might take it out of ARP air and say, automobile exhaust.
Contrary to what Marshall has so brilliantly suggested in all his writing, I think there are absolute standards in this thing, culture, in art and literature, and that these standards you can measure one age against another, and that we happen to have lived, no great misfortune really, we happen to have lived in what amounts to a Dark Ages.
We're a highly integral civilization. And this is what distresses people who belong to the old specialist, disintegrated one. They can't find a little place for themselves.
Yes, but are you sure, you see, are you absolutely sure that this is the birth struggle of a new civilization?
Oh, yeah.
Are you absolutely sure that it's not just the breakup?
No, the
not just the
circuit is
breakup.
new.
See, that's what I think is perhaps the whole difference between North America and Europe, really, is that you over here do believe that. But you do over here.
You have a bigger stake in the old technology.
Well, no, but we're inclined to think that all these things that you imagine to be of such enormous importance, like, for instance, this thing we're doing now on television, because a lot of people goop at television for hours every day, you're inclined to think that's an enormously important thing. And I just think it's a sort of sign of the kind of vacuity that comes when a civilization breaks, like the circuses in Rome. If there'd been a Marshal McLuhan, then, you see, Caius Marcius McLuhanibus, he would have written a great book about the circuses, and he'd have said, here's this new civilization coming.
There's no medium.
No, they had no new technology. But Caesar, by the way, educated the Gauls by war. This is the approved Western method of educating backward areas, is warfare. And Alexander the Great did it that way. Napoleon, I was reading a book on the Russian Revolution the other day in which the author was explaining enthusiastically that the great forward thrust in Russian institutions came from the Napoleonic invasions. And then from the Crimean War. What is happening in the Vietnam now is a great educational forward thrust from us on the war front, on the war path.
It's very pleasant to think of it that way.
I think it's a horribly, it's like roast pig. You know what Charles Lamb's theory of roast pig? You like roast pig? Burn your house down.
Burn your house down. Well,
that's how we do it.
Yes, and this is why I'm a bit inclined to agree with you. But I don't think it's done consciously. I think that's just because...
Oh, no, we never do anything consciously.
No.
Would you say that this North American society is basically optimistic still?
Yes,
and
I would.
European is basically pessimistic?
In a very general term, I would. I mean, the thing is that because I think, and here I'm rather sticking my neck out, but I'm going to say this, and Marshall may disagree with me very strongly, but I'm going to say this, that you over here do believe that the environment that men create governs their nature and their lives. And I don't believe in that. I think that this is only a very small part.
We are of 18th century origin, and it was precisely at that time that Rousseau invented the theory that the environment was the great educator.
That's right, and a load of rubbish it was. absolute
However,
rubbish, which has
nature-
produced the present chaotic
Nature as a
situation.
teaching machine is now capable of being programmed by human intention.
Yes, but you see, these, in a way, Marshall, that's only just words, isn't
No,
it?
no.
I mean, you program it like men, you mean like men program computers. You mean they put in something and then the computer, but you see, that's a non-creative
But it's like programming lighting levels, sound levels, temperature levels.
Yeah, but is this
Exactly,
a
but
pleasant
that's
idea?
not life.
Is this
You see,
an idea to be
that's
welcomed?
This is, well, whether it's welcome or not, my great point that I'm trying to make is that that is not life, that's a surface thing, you see.
Oh.
And I think that life's about something much more than that.
It's like saying, though, isn't it, that disease is not just a matter of symptoms. On the other hand, if you can get rid of all the symptoms, who cares what disease he
Well,
has?
but the fact is, the simple fact is, taking that analogy, is that treating the symptoms does not cure the disease.
No, but getting rid
Because
of the
disease
symptoms does.
wouldn't completely. Very often, if you treat a symptom and get rid of it, you get another.
What do you think about the young people who are in this hippie thing? You're one of their favorite people. Are they among your favorite people?
Well, I can't say that I have given them too much cause for comfort, or I haven't done very much beside just observe what sort of form their behavior seems to indicate is behind their life. And I can see clearly that they're desirous of a very much more rich social life, involvement in social life. And the mere finding of little niches and jobs and so on will not satisfy them.
Aren't they becoming tribalized the way
Yes.
you say the whole world is, and they are actually doing it?
Tribal,
and they even
though.
use the word, don't they?
I don't know, but tribal is not a new form exactly. But post-literate tribal is a very different matter from pre-literate tribal. And we're tribalizing simply by virtue of a much closer family, a sense of the human family.
In this part of the world, you are inclined to say, now, as Marshall does, 200 years ago, printing was invented. Then,
500.
500 years ago, printing was invented. Life's never been the same since then.
No, absolutely true.
I don't agree with that. I think that printing or television, all these things, they affect the surface of man. But the fascination of life, to me, is the exact opposite that I find in Socrates and St. Augustine and St. Paul, all those people who lived before printing.
But not before writing.
Oh, well, if you like.
By the way, there's a wonderful book by Eric Havelock called Preface to Plato, in which he just mentions in passing that what Socrates' great contribution was to the dialectic was the ability to say, would you mind repeating that, please? The Socratic irony, the Socratic questioning was a playback. With the coming of writing, the possibility of playback came into human society for the first time. Socrates was very much a product of technology, new technology.
Well, I wouldn't dispute that, Marsh. I wouldn't presume to dispute it. But what I would say is that if you, as far as I've been able in a very sort of amateur way, to read and think about the various contributions to knowledge which have been produced at different times, the thing that astonishes me about them is the huge area which is the same, which is constant, and how narrow is the area that belongs to particular environmental changes, whether a civilization is in a very stable or advanced state, or whether it's in a chaotic state. There are two questions that you can ask about life, really. You can ask the question how, and you can ask the question why. Now, I'm passionately interested in the question why, and I'm not much interested in the question how. But I think you're enormously interested in the question how.
Remember the phrase polite society when that came in? This historically meant a society that established its values on the word or the behavior that was capable of inspection, that would bear looking at. And polite society no longer is with us because we no longer live in a visual culture. And so the values of polite society are for the birds. And I'm not free of the nostalgic look back at some of those old values. On the other hand, I can see why they've gone down the drain, and I can see why new ones are forming right under our noses. And I can see why the new ones create such revulsion, total recoil.
It so happens that both Muggeridge and McLuhan were converts to Catholicism. Muggeridge, in my opinion, was one of the handful of great essayists of the 20th century. He became intensely religious late in life, at a time when he believed Western civilization was disintegrating and was very likely doomed because of an inner decay, which television was only hastening. Muggeridge was a reigning star of British talk show TV, and he knew the medium, in terms of content at least, inside out. He was now casting his lot with the kingdom of God. McLuhan had also cast his lot with the kingdom of God, but he was ambivalent about the current condition of the earthly sphere. I think part of him loved the electric age because it was his baby, his intellectual discovery. And as a Catholic, he harbored the notion that the new technology might actually make it possible to create Teilhard de Chardin's noosphere here on Earth. But in his personal life, he remained a traditionalist and a conservative. Even as a scholar, his inclinations, as opposed to his words, remain those of the literary man. The ambivalence suddenly pops out in a remarkable lecture he gave at Florida State University in 1970. Note his surprising last line in what we're about to see. Right now, the people in this room are making the decision whether or not we're going to have any more literacy and any more civilization in the 20th century, or whether it's going to stop right here.
One of the big flips that's taking place in our time is the changeover from the eye to the ear. And most of us, having grown up in a visual world, are now suddenly confronted with the problems of living in an acoustic world, which is, in effect, a world of simultaneous information. The visual world has very peculiar properties, and the acoustic world has quite different properties. The visual world, which belongs to the old 19th century, and which had been around for quite a while, say from the 16th century anyway, the visual world has the properties of being a sort of continuous and connected and homogeneous, all parts more or less alike, and static. Things stayed put. If you had a point of view, that stayed put. The acoustic world, which is the electric world of simultaneity, has no continuity, no homogeneity, no connections, and no stasis. Everything is changing. So that's quite a big shift. I mean, to move from one of those worlds to the other is a very big shift. It's the same shift that Alice in Wonderland made, when she went through the looking glass. She moved out of the visual world into the acoustic world when she went through the looking glass. Now, to explain a bit about the implications of this rather large shift, it concerns the whole problem of learning and teaching, and social life and politics and entertainment. I'm going to try to tie it into some of those places, but first I will try to make it a little bit more meaningful about how we became visual in the first place. There's only one part of the world that ever did go visual, and that is the Western Greco-Roman Hellenistic world. And about 500 BC, something happened which made it possible to flip out of the old acoustic world, which was the normal one of the tribal Greek society, the Homeric world. Something happened which flipped them out of the old Homeric world of the bards into this new, rational, philosophically logical, connected, private, individualistic, civilized world. And that thing is called the phonetic alphabet. Now, the phonetic alphabet has really, its origins are by no means clear at all. All we know is what it did to people. One of the peculiar things that happened with the phonetic alphabet was that the people who used it underwent a kind of fission. Their sensory life exploded, and the visual part of it was cut off from the kinetic, acoustic, and tactile parts. In all the other parts of the world where writing is employed, the visual life has always remained associated with the acoustic life and the tactile life and the kinetic life. But with the arrival of Euclid and visual space, you got a very strange possibility which Plato seized upon, and Plato developed his highly systematized philosophy, even more systematized later by Aristotle, his philosophy of the ideas, and the idea of rational control of the passions and of the world of nature. Now, this Platonic universe of abstract truth and abstract ideas is inconceivable without the phonetic alphabet. This alphabet gave people some very strange habits too. It filled people with the idea of imperial domination. Western man, with his alphabet, has always felt it mandatory that he impose it upon all other people. He must spread civilization by spreading literacy in all directions. Now, the Romans were the great implementers of this technology. They seized upon this form of writing to codify their laws and to make them uniformly applicable to all men. So it's helpful to know the origins of the alphabet and of civilization and rationality in that sense, because we have come in the 20th century to the end of that road. And it's a considerable revolution to have been through 2,500 years of phonetic literacy, only to encounter the end of the road. Right now, the people in this room are making the decision whether or not we're going to have any more literacy or any more civilization in the 20th century, or whether it's going to stop right here.
In the summer of 1970, I interviewed McLuhan for TV Ontario. The scene is the garden of the home he had just bought in Witchwood Park on a bluff above downtown Toronto, a truly park-like enclave in one of the city's most fashionable neighborhoods. This was a visible indication of his fast-rising status.
I think 100 years from now, historians, that's assuming that the Chinese will have any interest in current history, won't look at the 1960s in the case of, say, the United States as the era of the war in Vietnam or the moonshot or anything of that sort. I think it'll be looked at in terms of the way what you referred to as the ground has changed, the way people's lives, people have changed their ways of living.
We used to concentrate on figures, and now the ground itself has become figure. The area of attention has shifted from the older characters and to the ground. Now that includes audience. The audience has now become actor. Don't you think this is a tendency as a result of developments in our time?
Well, certainly Woodstock is a perfect example of that. Woodstock is probably the great typical event of our times because
Instant City.
It was set up from the very beginning. There was going to be a movie made of Woodstock. And rather than the people, as it started, I think everyone was paying their $18 for the weekend. Gradually, so many people came, they just abandoned that and let them all come in. Well, actually, they should have paid them all $18 as they came in, because they became the show.
Consider, in that regard, what we call coverage. Coverage now is no longer just on a single individual, but on a whole complex action. That in turn, don't you think that both in Vietnam, in Ireland, the north of Ireland, the audience wants to get into the action, that the coverage encourages the audience to get into the action? I have been told by reporters from the north of Ireland that when the news is not on, and the cameras are ready to go, the public is all out in the streets, ready to go into action as soon as the cameras are.
That's marvelous.
That they all retire inside to watch the news, and then come outside to participate in covering the news and in acting it out themselves. Now, I think the difference between hired actors and the public itself is tending to merge. This kind of unexpected flip, it happened in the Eichmann trial. The coverage pushes up the figure into heroic dimensions dramatically, but at the same time involves the audience so completely in the process of his action that they begin to feel far more guilty than he did. He appears merely as a person carrying out orders, the orders of the community. He was a well-adjusted, nice guy who was doing what had to be done according to the audience command. The audience being so involved in this process that they now begin to feel like villain. Therefore, they want to cut that show right out of their lives.
Do you think this explains that really strange fascination that Arthur Bremer had with Sirhan? He obviously looked at Sirhan as some kind of heroic figure. He wasn't this poor, helpless, useless human being who had done this desperate thing, and that's certainly not in Arthur Bremer's eyes.
No, and again, he had made the news. Sirhan had made the news. Now, this you can take in every sense of the word as having gotten into the news, having been created into a vast figure by the news. Making the news is a very strange phrase, but the media themselves can now create events that are so much bigger than people, so much bigger than the audience, that it really is a new mythic form.
What I would really like to do is just run down a checklist of all the predictions you made 6 years ago that people thought were absolutely crazy that have come true.
I have always been very careful never to predict anything that had not already happened. The future is not what it used to be.
McLuhan became amazingly adept at integrating whatever subject I or anybody else could suggest to him into his theory, on the spot, without a moment's hesitation. Woodstock, Sirhan's assassination of Bobby Kennedy, the Middle East War of 1967, the war in Vietnam, it didn't matter. McLuhan was never at a loss. At one point, I was working on 2 articles for New York Magazine, one on McLuhan and the other on the so-called topless restaurants of San Francisco. McLuhan happened to be in San Francisco, and so I got the bright idea of taking him to lunch at a topless restaurant, a place called the Off-Broadway. The Off-Broadway was very much in the news because of a lawsuit seeking to ban its specialty, which was bare-breasted waitresses, the topless part of the topless restaurant. So we went. Also at our party were Howard Gossage and the famous San Francisco newspaper columnist Herb Cain. Topless restaurants were a brand new concoction, and none of us, not even Cain, had ever been to one before. And none of us was prepared for the scene inside. About 100 men in business suits huddled at tables in a Stygian darkness, while spotlights picked out a dozen or so of the topless waitresses. Young women, their breasts swollen with silicone implants, their nipples rouged, wearing nothing but G-strings and high-heeled shoes, serving drinks, food, and eyefuls of their bare, spotlit bodies. Gossage, Cain, and I were the supposed men of the world, the media veterans, the boulevardiers. McLuhan was a college professor from Canada. But the boulevardiers were speechless. We didn't utter a sound. McLuhan, on the other hand, never skipped a beat. He took one look and said, "That's very interesting." So I said, "What's interesting, Marshall?" And he said, "They're wearing us. We're their clothes." This remains my favorite line on the late 20th century sex industry in America. And yet I don't think McLuhan was trying to be funny. Despite his disclaimers to the contrary, he was working on a completely closed, self-contained body of theory and developing the knack of drawing the entire contemporary world into it, impromptu, topless waitresses and all.
Global Village is not created by the motor car or even by the airplane. It's created by instant electronic information movement. The global village is at once as wide as the planet and as small as a little town where everybody is maliciously engaged in poking his nose into everybody else's business. The global village is a world in which you don't necessarily have harmony. You have extreme concern with everybody else's business and much involvement in everybody else's life. It's a sort of Ann Landers column writ large. And it doesn't necessarily mean harmony and peace and quiet, but it does mean huge involvement in everybody else's affairs. And so the global village is as big as the planet and as small as the village post office. The medium is totally participant, uses the eye as an ear, not as an eye. Television is not a visual medium. It's an acoustic medium, and hence the participation is like music, not like vision. Vision is detached. You stand back and watch, but you don't stand back and watch television. You're in it. One thing I know, and I think other people know, is that when the politician goes on TV, he has to have charisma, or he's dead. And some people, charisma means looking like a lot of other people, like Cronkite. If you reassure people by resembling a lot of other people they know and approve of, you have charisma. When you're on the telephone or on the air, you do not have a physical body. All you have is an abstract image. When you do not have a physical body, as you do not on the air or on the phone, you are not the same person.
McLuhan loved to quote the historian Daniel Borston's aphorism, "A celebrity is someone who is well known for his well-knownness." And there you had McLuhan, in the sense that for the last 15 years of his life, he became known around the world as a famous theorist, like Freud or Einstein, even among millions who had no idea whatsoever what the theory was. As we are about to see, most of the popular talk show hosts of his time, the David Frosts, the Tom Brokaws, the Tom Snyders, the Mike McManuses, had their innings with this celebrated theorist of their medium. The fashion magazines Vogue, Harper's Bazaar, Glamour were aflutter with McLuhanism for years. Look magazine prevailed upon him to do an article with a Look writer, George Leonard, called The Future of Sex. Playboy made him the subject of one of their marathon Playboy interviews, although what the magazine's readers must have made of it all, I can't imagine. And yet McLuhan continued to publish serious work as prolifically as before. He wrote countless scholarly articles enlarging upon his theory, but also literary pieces on Francis Bacon, Cicero, and those great favorites from his Cambridge days, Wyndham Lewis and G.K. Chesterton. He started publishing a newsletter called the McLuhan Dew Line. The original Dew Line was an early warning system for detecting incoming missiles that the United States had installed in northern Canada. McLuhan was offering his subscribers early warnings about changes in the human environment wrought by the new electric media. He also published 7 books, all of them, however, in collaboration with other writers. The Medium is the Massage, and War and Peace in the Global Village with Quentin Fiore. Through the Vanishing Point, subtitled Space in Poetry and Painting, and Counterblast with Harley Parker. From Cliché to Archetype with Wilfred Watson, Take Today, The Executive as Dropout with Barrington Nevitt, and McLuhan Hot and Cool with Gerald Stern. The Medium is the Massage was the sort of pun McLuhan loved. He was a great student of the most extravagant of all exercises in puns, James Joyce's Finnegan's Wake. In fact, he's the only person I ever met who knew the book backward and forward. The Medium is the Massage was a play, of course, on The Medium is the Message. The Massage alludes to his theory that television is, in fact, a tactile medium. In a moment on the David Frost Show, we will hear him come up with a pun that I particularly enjoyed as he expands upon his original impromptu insight at the off-Broadway restaurant that noontime a decade earlier in San Francisco and tells Frost, "The stripper takes off her clothes to put on her public." Practice makes perfect, I suppose, and by the mid-1970s, McLuhan had become quite adept at talk show repartee. When Tom Snyder suddenly says to him, "Has anybody ever asked you why people find you so hard to understand?" McLuhan tells him blithely, "It's because I use the right hemisphere of the brain when they're still trying to use the left." And then he adds, "Simple." McLuhan appeared on the David Frost Show on ABC in 1972, just after the publication of The Executive as Dropout.
What's made you turn to the subject from communications to executives?
The executive is in a great bind today because of the enormous speed with which he has to cope with data. It's the old organization chart belonging to the old hardware world of the 19th century has simply flipped upside down with the speed of electric information, and so the little slots that the execs used to fit into in the business world no longer hold them.
On one radio thing I heard, you said TV has in a way ended war, you think?
By bringing war immediately into our living rooms, it has become unbearable, intolerable. So that coverage has actually taken the place of war itself, as it were. The coverage is now bigger than the war.
That there can never be an acceptable war again?
That's true. Acceptable is one thing. But the coverage of the war is so colossal that war has become unbearable.
But yeah. Say it was a highly acclaimed, well, it's a terrible word to use, but it was a war that acclaimed war, a war people were in favor of. Could television increase the fervor for the war as it's increased the fervor against it?
It would cool it very fast.
And is television enriching or the reverse our lives, do you think?
It enormously enriches because it will not tolerate specialism. The TV age is an age of complex role-playing involvement. For example, strikes today, just beginning. A striker is a person who is not really seeking money so much as seeking a role. He wants to be noticed as playing an important role in the world. You go on strike not so much to strengthen your position in a specialist job as to announce the fact that you are a significant being.
Well, why do you say that hijacking, you said in another quote, hijacking is typical of today's world? You would expect hijacking in today's world.
When Sputnik went around the planet, nature disappeared. Nature was hijacked right off this planet. Nature was enclosed in a man-made environment, and art took the place of nature. This was one of the biggest hijack jobs conceivable. When you put a new service environment around, say, TV, with hologram or whatnot, you will find that TV has been completely hijacked, that a new service environment has come in. It isn't in yet. But when you put TV around movies, movies were hijacked. The whole service industry of movies was hijacked, and another service industry went around. When Sputnik went around the planet became an art form, nature disappeared overnight, and planet Pluto took place of the old nature. Planet Pluto, discovered to be in a very bad state, needing a great deal of human attention, art form.
McLuhan was then joined by Frost's next guest, the actor Peter Fonda.
Come and take a seat, Peter. Do you agree or not with what Marshall's just been saying about... That's very, very gracious of you, Peter, to do that for his book. With what Marshall's been saying, the two things he was saying about television making war unbearable, and that the Sputnik generation, that Sputnik and all of that changed the world for the people who live in it?
One question about the television war. I feel that it makes it unbearable to an extent, but the problem is we cut to an Ajax ad and clean it all up right away, you understand? So everybody thinks it's all right because they're still cutting to Ajax. But it also creates a theater for the war to play on a grand scale. Whereas some guerrilla warfare or something that happened in North Ireland would never be known about throughout the world, now it's known throughout the world. We discussed this earlier.
Oh.
So the media gives also a great stage for it to play on. Now the Sputnik thing is really very easy. The first time the idea occurred to me, or the first time I heard it, or rather, I listened to Mr. McLuhan speaking to a bunch of television writers, editors of magazines and so forth in 1964. I think it was radio telescopes that you talked about then, and how that created a consciousness of the Earth as an art form, because it became the past and it became something we could then deal with. It wasn't something that, what's the saying, you know, you can't see the forest for the trees? When you're living on the planet, you don't know anything else, you can't see the planet. But now we've been to the moon, we've seen it's a little tiny thing floating out in space. We don't know where it is, but there it is, you know. Now we can deal with it. Now we can take upon ourselves such enormous problems as cleaning up the atmosphere, stopping wars, understanding what it is to be one person on a planet, one group of people, not ethnic groups or not nationalist groups, and see where that's at. Now we understand the atrocity of Vietnam. We understand all these absurdities because we have created the art form to look at the planet. It becomes Williamsburg, Pennsylvania.
Like Woodstock, a sort of instant city.
Instant city, right, you see? And we have to take care of it like Disneyland, you see?
Oh.
Yes. Well, let's get some brooms and clean it up, you know, because it's our act and we blew it.
Why do you explain the obsession with things like nudity and so on in movies and so on today?
Yes, explain. I'll comment at least. Nudity is not nakedness.
Ah, that away.
The nude is clad in the public that wishes to see her.
What?
The nude is clad in her audience. The stripper takes off her clothes to put on her public. When she steps backstage,
put on her public.
She puts on her public. When she steps backstage, she's naked.
That's right.
But out front, she is dressed completely.
She's nude.
She's nude in her birthday suit.
In 1976, McLuhan appeared on NBC's Tomorrow Show with Tom Snyder and delivered another of his famous aphorisms that turned common sense upside down. Charisma means looking like a lot of other people.
At the speed of light, there is no sequence. Everything happens at the same instant. That's acoustic, and everything happens at once. There's no continuity, there's no connection, there's no follow-through. It's just all now. And that, by the way, is the way any sport is. Sports tend to be like that. And in terms of the new lingo of the hemispheres, it's all right hemisphere. Games are all right hemisphere. And because they involve the whole man, and they are all participatory, and they're all uncertain, they're not, there's no continuity, there's just all surprise, unexpectedness, and total involvement.
Is that okay, do you think?
The hemisphere thing?
Yeah, but I mean the whole thing, no surprise, all spontaneity, no connection, just all at one time. Is that okay for people?
Well, okay, meaning is it good for people?
Yes.
We live in a world where everything is supposed to be one thing at a time, lineal, connected, logical, and goal-oriented. So obviously for that left hemisphere world, this new right hemisphere dominance is bad. We're now living in a world which pushes the right hemisphere way up, because it's an all-at-once world. The right hemisphere is an all-at-once simultaneous world. So the right hemisphere, by pushing up into dominance, is making the old left hemisphere world, which is our educational establishment, our political establishment, make it look very foolish.
What do you think is the most, I want to use the word effective, but that's not the right word, but I'm talking about television here. What has the greatest impact on audience?
From is a TV program.
Is television best when it covers an event like a space shot or the Olympics or a baseball game? Is it best when it tries to entertain with movies at night, when it tries to inform with news programs that have films of things that have already happened?
The advantage of coverage of sports events is they are ritualistic. The group gathered there is participating in a ritual. Now the Olympics were even more a group ritual than the ordinary competitive event in a ball game or a single ball game, a single event, because they had a corporate meaning. It was not just a local, it was a sort of a worldwide meaning. And this is itself a ritualistic participation in a large process. Television fosters and favors a world of corporate participation in ritualistic programming. It's not really, that's what I mean when I say it's a cool medium. It's not a hot medium. A hot medium can, like a newspaper, can cover single events, very high intensity. TV is not good at covering single events. It needs a ritual, a rhythm, and a pattern. And that's why a lot of advertising on TV, you see, is too hot, too special, too fragmentary. Doesn't have that ritualistic flow. But the advertisers are aware of this, and they're doing a lot to correct that. But I think that was the great secret of a thing like the Olympics. People had the feeling of participating as a group in a great, meaningful ritual. And it didn't much matter who won. That wasn't the point. But I think TV tends to foster that type of pattern in events. Well, you might say it tends to foster patterns rather than events. I was here during the tornado or the hurricane, and I was amazed at the excitement that generated in everybody, expectancy, and it was covered so thoroughly that it dissipated the storm itself. The coverage actually got rid of the storm. I think that is one of the functions of news, to blow up a storm so big that you can dissipate it by coverage. It's a way of getting rid of the pressure by coverage. That you can actually dissipate a situation by giving it a maximal coverage. It's very disappointing from one angle, but it's survival from another
But now
angle.
don't you get into alarming people?
That's done by rumors, not by coverage. Hints, suggestions. But the big coverage merely enables people to get together and enjoy the sort of a group emotion. It's like being at a ball game, a big group emotion. But I do think that taught me that one of the mysteries of coverage is that it's a way of releasing tension and pressure.
What would happen if you could shut off television for 30 days in the entire United States of America?
It would be a kind of hangover effect because it's very addictive medium. And you take it away and people develop all the symptoms of a hangover. Very uncomfortable. It was tried, remember, a few years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, they actually paid people not to watch TV for a few months.
I don't recall that, but I'm sure
it was in Germany. It was in Germany. It was in the UK. And they discovered they had all the withdrawal symptoms of drug addicts. And very uncomfortable, all the trauma of withdrawal symptoms. The TV is a very, very involving medium, and it is a form of inner trip. And so people do miss it.
The thought just occurred to me that possibly if you turned off television, there would be a lot of people who would say at the end of the 30-day period, we will not permit you to turn it back on. Do you think that could happen?
A great many of the teenagers have stopped watching television. They're saturated. Saturation is a possibility. About the possibility of reneging on any future TV, I doubt it. I doubt that, except through saturation. But the TV thing is so demanding and therefore so soporific that it requires an enormous amount of energy to participate in. You don't have that freedom of detachment.
We're just talking about basic television programs.
Yeah. Well, one of the effects of television is to remove people's private identity. They become corporate, peer group people just by watching it. They lose interest in being individual, private individuals. And so this is one of the hidden and perhaps insidious effects of television.
Have you watched enough of Jimmy Carter during all the primaries to figure out why he has been so effective with his presentations on television?
Well, I haven't seen a great deal, but his charisma is very simply identified. He looks like an awful lot of other people. He looks like an all-American boy. He looks like all the American boys that ever were, which is charisma. Charisma means looking like a lot of other people. If you just look like yourself, you have no charisma. So Carter has a lot of built-in charisma of that, looking like a lot of other guys. Very acceptable guys.
How helpful would you be to Mr. Carter or whomever the Republicans choose if they were to come to you and say, you know, Mr. McLuhan, we'd like to hire you for a specified fee to advise us on a political campaign?
I could tell them when they were hotting up the image too much and phasing out that charisma. The temptation of any campaign manager is to hot up the image until it alienates everybody. And they don't realize when they're doing it.
How do you know when the image is getting too hot?
Specialized. The moment it begins to specialize, it phases out the group.
What do you mean specialize?
It begins to look more and more like one guy. It begins to look more and more like Jimmy Carter and less like the rest of America.
Forgive my impertinence, but has anybody asked you why you are sometimes difficult to understand?
Because I use the right hemisphere when they're trying to use the left hemisphere.
Okay, well,
simple.
I'll try and get back on the left.
You see, when the people ordinarily people are trained to try to follow you and to connect everything you say with what they last heard. They're not prepared to use their wits. They're only prepared to use the idea they picked up the first time and try to connect it to another idea. So if you're in a situation that is flexible, where you have to use your wits and perceptions, they can't follow you. They have preconceptions that phase them out at once. You see, that's left hemisphere. I use the right hemisphere a great deal, which is a world of perception, no concepts. I don't use any.
Got you. You don't try to connect things. You just let the right hemisphere take over and let it go.
And watch what's happening. And so that is the way the cookie crumbles, sort of thing, where you don't know what's going to happen, but you follow the crumble.
That same year, 1976, McLuhan was invited onto NBC's Today Show with Tom Brokaw and Edwin Newman, the day after a television debate between Jimmy Carter and Gerald Ford during the final stages of the 1976 presidential campaign. He had great fun with the fact that the debate had to be halted halfway through because of an electrical malfunction, with the cameras still running and the two candidates standing stock still and silent at their lecterns like a pair of mannequins, or as McLuhan put it, two men standing in barrels while their pants are being pressed. In introducing McLuhan, you'll notice that Brokaw makes what was a common mistake. He identifies him as the author of a book called The Medium is the Message. McLuhan wrote Understanding Media, and he wrote The Medium is the Massage, but The Medium is the Message was simply the most famous of all his aphorisms.
Marshall McLuhan is practically a household word in this television conscious society. He's from the University of Toronto, of course, the author of a book called The Medium is the Message, and he came to New York last night so that he could watch the debates, watch them not so much from a policy point of view, but from a television point of view.
The glorious moment was the rebellion of the medium against the bloody message. The medium finally rebelled against the most stupid arrangement of any debate in the history of debating.
Why was it stupid? Not from a
by scripting point of view. Mm-hmm. The characters who had arranged that debate and scripted every aspect of it had no understanding of TV. And they didn't even know that TV is not a debating medium. Mm-hmm. And they had arranged it as if it were a newspaper setup or a radio setup. They had no awareness of TV. With the breakdown in the technology, the audience finally got into the act.
Well, Professor McLuhan, if this debate had been arranged by people who, in your view, knew and understood television, how would it have been done?
Well, now, this would take quite a while to explain, but it would be much closer to what we're doing right here. Chatting casually, spontaneously, without a script, and paying attention to what is being said. What those men said last night was merely to hold the audience on the image. It didn't matter at all what was said last night. The image was what mattered, and as anything that could hold the attention on the image was all that mattered, from the point of view of the arrangers.
Well, you are the proponent, of course, that television is a cool medium.
Yes.
Both candidates last night were programmed and costumed and made up precisely.
Had either candidate dared to present a policy, it would have destroyed his image.
Was one more cool than the other from a purely television point of view?
No, they're both in a state of panic cool. They were terrified of making a false step. And they're quite rightly so.
Why shouldn't they be terrified? After all, why shouldn't they have all of these conditions on television debate when they're running for the highest office and they want to control the environment?
With the breakdown in the mechanism, there was the wonderful revelation of all the characters who had scripted the show. They came out into the open like something out of the woodwork and revealed that a stupid show had been put together very carefully, and by people who had no idea of what the TV medium is about.
Would you argue, Professor McLuhan, that the candidates would be better off not to debate than to debate in the manner in which they did?
Of course.
The candidates...
They were standing in press-the-pants barrels, looking absolutely like some straight-jacketed characters, absolutely the hottest type of medium you could imagine. Everything that the scripters and arrangers had done was hot stuff. They had no idea of what the TV medium is made of.
Professor McLuhan, you think that this medium is the future, that this is how society will be shaping its opinions and so on?
Is the present.
Is the present and the future.
Which is also the future.
But why do you continue to print books and write books?
This is an outlet, and you might as well ask, why does somebody continue to make chewing gum? And it's an outlet for various activities. But I've never been against the book, for heaven's sake. I'm a professor of literature. I teach books from morning till night.
On the Mike McManus show in Toronto in 1979, just 18 months before he died, McLuhan delivered two more fascinating aphorisms. All forms of violence are quests for identity, and the literate man is the natural sucker for propaganda, which he explains by saying, you cannot propagandize a native. You can sell him rum and trinkets, but you cannot sell him ideas.
In the early 50s, you predicted that the world was becoming a global village.
We're going back into the bicameral mind, which is tribal, collective, without any individual consciousness.
But it seems, Dr. McLuhan, that this tribal world is not friendly.
Oh, no. Tribal people, one of their main kinds of sport is sort of butchering each other. It's a full-time sport in tribal societies.
But I had some ideas. We got global and tribal. We were going to become...
The closer you get together, the more you like each other?
Yeah.
There's no evidence of that in any situation that we've ever heard of. that when people get close together, they get more and more savagely impatient with each other.
Well, why is that? Because of the nature of man, or
his tolerance is tested in those narrow circumstances very much. Village people aren't that much in love with each other. And the global village is a place of very arduous interfaces and very abrasive situations.
do you see any pattern of this in, for example, the desires of Quebec to separate?
I should think that they are feeling very abrasive about the English community and about the way the American South felt about the Yankee North 100 years ago.
And is this distancing, is this going to be a pattern right around the world now?
Apparently, separatisms are very frequent all over the globe at the present time. Every country in the world is loaded with regionalistic, nationalistic little groups.
But in Quebec, for example, they define it as the quest for identity.
Yes, all forms of violence are a quest for identity. When you live out on the frontier, you have no identity. You're a nobody. Therefore, you get very tough. You have to prove that you are somebody. And so you become very violent. And so identity is always accompanied by violence. This seems paradoxical to you? That ordinary people find the need for violence as they lose their identities. So it's only the threat to people's identity that makes them violence. Terrorists, hijackers, these are people minus identity. They are determined to make it somehow, to get coverage, to get noticed.
And all this is somehow an effect of the electronic age?
Oh, no. But people in all times have been this way. Mm-hmm. But in our time, when things happen very quickly, there's very little time to adjust to new situations at the speed of light. There's very little time to get accustomed to anything. One of the big violence makers of our century has been radio. Hitler was entirely a radio man. And a tribal man.
And what does television do then to that tribal man?
Well, I don't think Hitler would have lasted long on TV. Like Senator Joe McCarthy, he would have looked foolish. He was a very hot character. And like Nixon, made a very bad image on television. He was far too hot a character. Much better on radio or on the movies. Not bad on the movies, which will take quite hot characters. But Nixon was hopeless on TV.
The investigations now of the CIA and the FBI and even our own, God forbid, RCMP, has this anything to do with the electronic age?
Well, yes, because we now have the means to keep everybody under surveillance. No matter what part of the world they're in, we can put them under surveillance. It has become one of the main occupations of mankind, just watching other people and keeping a record of their goings-on.
And invading privacy.
Invading privacy, in fact, just ignoring it. Everybody has become porous. They got the light and the messages go right through us. By the way, at this moment,
right,
we are on the air, and on the air we do not have any physical body. When you're on the telephone or on radio or on TV, you don't have a physical body. You're just an image on the air. When you don't have a physical body, you're a discarnate being. You have a very different relation to the world around you. And this, I think, has been one of the big effects of the electric age. It has deprived people really of their private identity.
So that's what this is doing to me?
Yes. Everybody tends to merge his identity with other people at the speed of light. It's called being mass man. By the way, one of the big marks of the loss of identity is nostalgia. And so revivals on all hands in every phase of life today. Revivals of clothing, of dances, of music, of shows, of everything. We live by the revival. It tells us who we are or were.
Do you feel that the fact that you and I have enjoyed the rewards of literacy, that we are more protected against television than
Yes, I think you get a certain immunity. Just as you get a certain immunity from booze by literacy. The literate man can carry his liquor, the tribal man cannot. That's why in the Muslim world or in the native world, you cannot, booze is impossible. It's the demon rum.
However, literacy also, though, makes us very accessible to ideas and propaganda. The literate man is the natural sucker for propaganda. You cannot propagandize a native. You can sell him rum and trinkets, but you cannot sell him ideas. Therefore, propaganda is our Achilles heel. It's our weak point. We will buy anything if it's got a good hard sell tied to it.
What now briefly is this thing called media ecology?
It means arranging various media to help each other so they won't cancel each other out, to buttress one medium with another. You might say, for example, that radio is a bigger help to literacy than television.
Mm-hmm.
But television might be a very wonderful aid to teaching languages. And so you can do some things on some media that you cannot do on others. And therefore, if you watch the whole field, you can prevent this waste that comes by one canceling the other out.
In 15 seconds, I've got one question for you. How much television do you watch?
Whenever I get a chance. Not too often.
In the wake of all the excitement over understanding media, McLuhan established the Center for the Study of Culture and Technology at the University of Toronto. This was an imposing laboratory-like name for what was, in fact, little more than a letterhead, a desk, the lined paper on which he wrote by hand, and his amazingly fertile and facile mind. In this respect, McLuhan was like Sigmund Freud. Very little of what Freud had to say has survived the scientific scrutiny of the past half-century. In hindsight, we can see that he was a brilliant philosopher of the old school who happened to live in an age in which only science was accepted as gospel truth. So by night, he let his philosophical speculations in through the back door of his clinic, and in the morning he marched them out the front door as scientific findings. Thus also with McLuhan at the Center for the Study of Culture and Technology. At bottom, McLuhan remained through it all a literary man in the grand tradition of Samuel Johnson, Thomas Carlyle, Matthew Arnold, and G.K. Chesterton, with the gift of brilliant flashes of insight into the era in which he lived. He never endeared himself to literary people, however, because so many of his wittiest Chesterton-like sayings were at their expense. Asked to comment on the headlong rush of writers and scholars into protest movements during the 1960s, McLuhan said, "Moral indignation is a standard strategy for endowing the idiot with dignity." But artists, particularly young artists, tended to be highly enthusiastic about McLuhan, as did young people of all sorts who were aware of his work. He seemed to be paying their generation the implied compliment of placing them at the center of an entirely new phase of human evolution. And that is precisely the enthusiasm that the latest new generation, the young denizens of the internet, or cyberspace as they like to think of it, feel for McLuhan today. In September of 1979, McLuhan suffered a debilitating stroke and died 15 months later in his sleep on December the 31st, 1980. But near the end, he left some clues as to what he had intended as the culmination, the ultimate synthesis of his theory. This came in his final television appearance, a lecture in the spring of 1979 at York University in Toronto. He had begun to look at all human artifacts, as he called them, from the earliest tools to the electric media, including computers, as extensions of the human body and the human nervous system, and as components of a human evolution such as Darwin could have never imagined. But Teilhard de Chardin had imagined such a thing, and I think it's entirely possible that McLuhan might have been about to make explicit the convergence of his thoughts with those of the great Jesuit mystic.
I'm going to mention an aspect of media which I've been working on a good deal lately. And I have a preface to a new book which begins, "All of man's artifacts of language, of laws, of ideas, hypotheses, tools, clothing, computers, all of these are extensions of our physical bodies." Hans Haas, in The Human Animal, sees this human power to create additional organs as an enormity from the evolutionary standpoint, an advance laden with unfathomable consequences. The laws of the media are observations on the operation and effects of human artifacts on man and society, since, as Hans Haas further notes, a human artifact is not merely an implement for working upon something, but an extension of our body effected by artificial additional organs, to which, to a greater or lesser degree, we owe our civilization.
One thing overlooked by Hans Haas is the absence of biological or psychological means of coping with the effects of our own technical ingenuity in creating new organs. The problem is clearly indicated in some simians in man's presumptuous brain, when he says that when, about 500,000 years ago, man began slowly to embark upon the road to cultural advance, an entirely new situation arose. The use of implements and the control of fire introduced artifacts of which the cortex could avail itself for purposes of living. These artifacts had no relationship whatever to the organization of the body and could therefore not be integrated into the functioning of the brainstem. What Simians is saying is that our natural responses to media and to technology are irrelevant, that we cannot trust our instincts or our natural physical responses to new things. They will destroy us. How are we to bypass or offset the merely physical response to new technology and new environments created by new technologies? This problem has not been raised by anybody, except that we have to live with it every day. Edgar Allan Poe has a story called The Descent into the Maelstrom, which had tremendous influence in the 19th century on the poets and symbolists like Baudelaire and Flaubert and others. In The Descent into the Maelstrom, Poe imagines the situation in which a sailor who has gone out on a fishing expedition is caught by not watching the turn of the tide in a huge maelstrom or whirlpool, and he sees that his boat will be sucked down into this thing. He begins to study the action of the storm. He observes that some things disappear and some things reappear. By studying the things that reappear, to which he attaches himself to one of these, he saves himself. Pattern recognition in the midst of a huge, overwhelming, destructive force is the way out of the maelstrom. The huge vortices of energy created by our media present us with similar possibilities of evasion, of consequences, of destruction. By studying the pattern of the effects of this huge vortex of energy in which we're involved, it may be possible to program a strategy of evasion and survival. The survival cannot be trusted to natural response or natural instinct, since the brain stem is not provided with any means of responding to man-made environments. I'm going to read a passage from Anthony Storr in The Human Aggression, in which he observes, "It is obviously true that most bomber pilots are no better, no worse than other men. The majority of them, given a can of petrol and told to pour it over a child of 3 and ignite it, would probably disobey the order. Yet put a decent man in an aeroplane a few hundred feet above a village, and he will kill without compunction, drop high explosives, inflict appalling pain and injury on men, women, and children. The distance between him and the people he's bombing make them into an impersonal target, no longer human beings like himself with whom he can identify." This is characteristic situation. That bomber pilot is really very much like the person introducing any new technology using ordinary human business resources and existing institutional means. None of these people ever consider what will be the impact or the effect of what they do when they pull that trigger. Quite apart from the use of weaponry at a distance, there is the effect of changes in man himself which result from using his own devices to create environments of service. Any new service environment, such as that created by railways or motor cars or telegraph or radio, deeply modify the very nature and image of the people who use them. Radical changes of identity happening in very sudden, brief intervals of time have proved more deadly and destructive to human values than were wars fought with hardware weapons. In the electric age, the alteration of human identity by new service environments of information have left whole populations without personal or community values to a degree that far exceeds the effects of food and fuel and energy shortages. It is hoped that many improvements on this approach will be suggested by the readers of this book. Meantime, I suggest it possible to begin by noticing A, what does the artifact amplify or enhance in the case of any new form of medium or technology? A, what does it enhance? B, what does it obsolesce? And third, what does it bring back from a distant past that was unexpectedly scrapped earlier? And finally, what does it flip into when pushed to the full limit of its power? I'll give you a few examples of this pattern of these four phases or stages in the development of any artifact whatever. I just have in front of me, in isolation from other things, camera. A, it enhances by its snapshotting aggression and private power over people. B, it obsolesces privacy. It retrieves the past as present. It brings back the big game hunter. Bringing him home alive means bringing people home alive. Photographic journalism is very big game hunting. It flips into the public domain. The clock amplifies work. Until clock, what we call work was almost impossible to organize. It obsolesces leisure. It retrieves history as art form by fixed chronology, a measurable sequential chronology capable of visual time as measured by the clock. It reverses when pushed all the way into the eternal present, a nowness. Electric media in general amplify information range, scope, pushing information into a surface environment by simultaneity, obsolesces the visual, the connected, the logical, the rational, retrieves the subliminal, audile, tactile, dialogue, involvement, brings back, rather, reverses, finally, all hardware into software. People have always been unaware of new environments because they're afraid of them. From the moment of birth, people sense the new environment around them is hostile. It's a real threat to their whole existence. So every time an environment changes, we hasten to seek security and comfort in the old environment. I was delighted to come across a passage in Shakespeare a few days ago, a familiar passage, which suddenly revealed the same message. One touch of nature makes the whole world kin, that each, with one consent, pursues newborn gods, though they be made and molded of things past. The new is always made up of the old, or rather what people see in the new is always the old thing, never the present image or the present fact. The future of the future is the present, and this is something that people are terrified of.